Hi, everybody. This is Ken Hogue, Chief Revenue Cycle Officer for UHS and National Chair of the RCM Innovators. Joining us today, I have Kaci Ramsey, who is the VP of Revenue Cycle for Confluence Health in Washington State, and also just named co-chair for the RCM Innovators. So welcome, and how are you this morning, Kaci?
Thanks, Ken. It's great to be with you. I'm really excited to be able to bring some clinical perspective with my nursing background to Connex Partners, to the RCM Innovators team, and just looking forward to the collaboration with the great participants that get to contribute to that group.
Absolutely. And we want to give a special thank you to Connex as well for giving us this space to talk about the revenue cycle as we start our series of the C-suite edge inside revenue cycle. So getting into things this morning, we know that revenue cycle, particularly over the last 10 years, and in some instances, every 6 months, it seems like anymore, is having drastic change. And we talk about the change that needs to happen and, the short runways often for our teams, their staff, and fostering a collaborative environment. But, this is something that wanted to have, 3 to 4 topics to talk about this morning. But the first one kind of that we're going to go into is how has revenue cycle really changed over the past 10 years and even more so within the last year from how Kaci, your organization and like peers of what we're seeing changing within the space?
That's a great question. I mean, revenue cycle has completely evolved. I've been in revenue cycle for 7 years. And so prior to that, I was in the clinical world. And 10 years ago, working on the clinical side, I would have said, what's revenue cycle? Um, Revenue cycle back then was really just about processing claims. Revenue cycle now is sort of the engine of the organization that's going to really make or break the survivability of the organization. I mean, we went during the COVID era um, to predictability. We knew what we were going to get paid. We knew what we were going to get reimbursed. We knew what was going to get denied and why. That has shifted significantly to, changing payer mixes, changing eligibility, more self-pay, more charity, higher deductible plans. And that doesn't even touch on the regulatory landscape that's vastly evolved. I think another kind of major change, which, if you look at from the perspective of what was positive during COVID, all of the future state healthcare suddenly happened overnight. We started, with telehealth and phone visits, and they were starting to then be reimbursed. So our the consumer expectation, I think, has changed, and it's gone from, this in-person old school um, way of getting their healthcare to now digital, video, text. And I think that's a great thing. It just has helped to evolve some of those new care models that have been coming out.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, to get a little bit even deeper into that, when we talk about COVID, I think many things have been taught about how do we modernize revenue cycle, right, for years. So for me, I've been in this business 20 years, but formally and worked into it, even growing up as a teenager within my grandparents' like practice. But when you look at, how the evolve of changes happen, telehealth, really almost went light years when COVID happened. And then now we are having some of the sustainability of like what actually is beneficial and what's not, because we also know that during COVID, it was hard for access and certain folks put healthcare off. So when we talk about, the changes, I think in what has happened within reimbursement and technology, we also have to now go back and be like, what worked? what didn't. And then as we continue to evolve, we need to be like, what is going to be sustainable? Because when we talk about like cost and pivoting and change and more clinical involvement within Rev Cycle, that's really where I think, things have like changed. And when you look at even within titles, right? So, you know, nurses and other indigent people in the organizations, it always was a little bit more siloed. You kind of had like, your different teams that were, your coding team may have gone and reported up through quality and, compliance in some organizations, the finance functions, traditionally like rev cycle, and even within titles. Like when I started in this business, 20 years ago, it was very unheard of unless you were an organization that was $10 billion or more net revenue to even have a vice president of revenue cycle. Like most organizations had, a director, a PFS, or maybe an executive director if they were, one of the large academic medical centers. And then over the past like 5 years, or I would say 10 years, you started to see more VPs of rev cycle, but even in the last 5 years, you've started to see VPs, AVPs, SVPs, chiefs, and different alignment. And everyone is kind of finding out what works for their organization, what works for the culture, and really who do they have in house and external to break down those barriers to really make sure that they have a champion to work through the change, because the change is every single month or every week. And then when you talk about removing those barriers, who's the person that can champion that, right? And then I think, the chief revenue cycle officer position, when you go back even a year or so ago, that has been where there maybe was only a couple. And then now, like if you see like what's posting or organizations, it's, hey, we've changed this now to a chief revenue cycle officer, and it's involving, more of the clinical aspects or bringing in case management and other things. So, what's your take on that? I guess is like, as we're moving, are from a clinical perspective, do you think it's moving in the right direction and really bringing those two together? Because before it's always collaboration, but yet still siloed.
I came from the clinical world. It was long overdue to start marrying these groups together. It was highly siloed, revenue cycle. When I joined, we had no clinical staff except for me in revenue cycle at all. There was none. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. How are they going to work with our physicians and our clinic leaders and our, nurses that actually are the ones that are posting charges? And how are we going to provide education on, denials? Because as we all know, denials start at the point of care. They start when you're scheduling patients. And we needed to make changes in our org structure and our relationships in order to mitigate those issues and really to continue our sustainability and survivability. I think, historically finance owned everything. Um, clinical documentation improvement, that was never part of really of a revenue cycle. It was kind of out there on its own. And so now we're looking like at the holistic ecosystem of healthcare and saying, what are those areas that really contribute to our margin, our bottom line? And where can we strategically place those in order to, reduce denials, increase our revenue? And so, a lot of rev cycles now are restructured with not just the traditional revenue cycle departments, coding, insurance follow-up, denials, patient services, but we're also now pulling in, CDI, case management, as you mentioned, um, also utilization management in some respects. I mean, they just all flow together. They're doing a lot of similar work and effort. I think we also have like these shared metrics that cross over with, we're looking at case mix index, we're looking at DRGs, we're looking at down coding. So it's sort of been a natural progression. I think one of the other great things is I have a physician dyad partner at our organization that we collaborate on, education and where's the need. And look at maternity service care is going to be changing significantly in 2027. And so our team is working on preparing and developing that education to drive those changes in reimbursement models. And we also have, a pharmacist on our team. We have several nurses on our team now, and we're using the data post, claim, post payment to drive the workflows and the change of behavior upstream to reduce all of that work on the back. So I really think that the evolution of revenue cycle and clinical operations and clinicians has really been a beautiful thing, and just something that's long overdue, and something every hospital system has to do if they want to remain sustainable.
Absolutely, like agree. And I mean, that's the thing in what does sustainable look like, right? So when we talk about, sustainability and breaking down those as far as like silos, I know like when I consulted, that is something that I like actually consulted on, how hospitals had to bring in outside consultants to really help them foster that change and breaking down those silos. Because when we talk a lot about the emotional attachment of who reports to who and what that organizational structure looks like, sometimes that's hard making those changes when people have reported to certain people for many years. But, when you look at, the finance, clinical, and case management right now, the downgrades that you spoke of, and then also the finance picture and acumen of what's changing, because in this business, like I tell everybody, healthcare is only one of the only other businesses that you can actually be paid for a service and then it comes back and then the money's taken away from you, right? Like anything else is more the service is provided and agreed. So it's a balance, but uh, to make sure that those silos or traditional things were broken down, I know for me, I had to really kind of go in a more Six Sigma approach or high reliability of the trust but verify. We need to trust that these decisions are going to be in the organization's or your team's best interest. But in order to verify that, that's after the changes were made. How do we have measurability? And then how do we also kind of like pulse and have those crucial conversations to break down those silos, give people time to adjust, but also to what was the next silo to work on. So from a clinical side, right, not in a traditional finance background, Casey, what did you find beneficial, like when you first came into revenue cycle to help break down part of those barriers with case management and clinical being a nurse? Because that's also something I think would be really interested to our audience for how to even have those conversations and breaking down and partnering.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. I mean, that's what drove me to revenue cycle, is that it was, the abyss. I had no idea what they did over in revenue cycle. And the only time I'd ever hear from revenue cycle is when my team, didn't get an authorization for, um, uh, a high dollar procedure, and we had to write it off. That's pretty much when I would hear from revenue cycle. And so, during that time, being a service line director of neurosciences, and then having my peers, we would sit around our meetings that we had every couple of weeks, and we'd just talk about our frustrations with not knowing what's happening. So I took that knowledge with me to revenue cycle. And one of the first things that we did was start using my peers and leaders across the organization, and some clinicians started developing sort of a foundational training program. And it was a requirement for all leaders to come through, because if they don't know or understand the work of the revenue cycle and every phase of that cycle where we could potentially lose dollars, then we're really doing a disservice. What's the point of, having revenue cycle if the people that are doing the work on the front end don't understand what the risks are and where we have, losses? So, I think knowing that the margins are getting much slimmer and their cost to collect is rising and our AR is aging and we have all these complex payer rules, we couldn't have fragmented processes anymore. We couldn't. So we had to collaborate and work together to create a more sustainable system where everyone kind of is aware of how to reduce our losses and maximize our, not just reimbursement, but
For one thing there, I think you said that just really originated with me. And I know like in our, RCM Innovators monthly meetings as well, that is something that comes up for those that are not at our level, right? Like the next level of like those that are directors that may, have career aspirations to go to the next level. When you talk about the big picture and part of that structure, I know here originally, how did we make something and define it as what is controllable and not when we even talk about the denials or the risk loss? Because sometimes you can do everything right. And then on a payer side, or if they use vendor support, it doesn't align. So that's something that is a non controllable denial. But from your area and when you were in the neurosciences, knowing that that's high dollars and things too, how did you help? In your role as like the VP, but also from neurosciences and gathering with your other peers to kind of help them better understand what's controllable or not. Because I know a lot of teams, once they get that communication out there, it's always a balance of we're going to communicate, but now we have to set guardrails because if not, it's just going to be like overreactive, right? Instead of a planned approach. So, do you have lessons learned or things that you gathered when you made the transition to the VP level within your organization leading RevCycle?
I think data is powerful. It's sometimes it's challenging to get the right data, but anytime you're sitting with clinicians, or clinic managers or leaders, you can't give opinion. I mean, I have a lot of opinions, but what will resonate more with them is the data, the write-offs, like, hey, this is our reality, not what I think our reality is or what my opinion of the reality is. So I think sharing the data and then giving them some support resources. So one of the things I know, Ken, that we've talked about is that we developed what we call a Rev Up program in our organization. And that program was really intended to provide the support and the one-on-one that our service lines need. And so each of our service lines has a liaison that they work with from revenue integrity. And then they partner, they look at denial trends together. They look at the headwinds that are coming our way, changes in, you know, medical necessity requirements and documentation. So we work with them on a kind of a wide array of things to try to prevent the downstream impact of denials and underpayments. And I think having that those relationships and those resources, and then tracking that to see what the return is, has been probably one of the most powerful things that we've had the opportunity to do. Because I guess, give a few examples is we've had some services in behavioral health that were denying, and we put some factors, we put some measures in place, and those denials stopped. So we had, $30,000+ in denials and write-offs for one particular service, and that stopped. So we can measure that over time. And that really served as a motivating factor for leaders to want to even further their collaboration and, looking at root cause more with our team. So I think you just have to have a holistic approach. Like, we're here to support. Revenue Cycle's here to support the people that are doing all of that hard work to bring the dollars in. But our team wants to maximize the dollars that we're able to bring in by reducing some of those front end errors and things that might cause the downstream reduction in
Well,
payment.
when you talk about like Rev Up within like Rev Cycle or others, going into, one of the questions here is why, modernization is required and how organizations should rethink structure, right? And I know like change is hard for folks, especially when they've done it a certain way and it really has, worked for them for years, but then you know that there's changes coming in the future and you need to be proactive and plan for those. But I think we need to modernize our organizations, and in order to break down the barriers or silos, you actually have to make it kind of like fun, almost more like a road show, or like how your program like Rev Up, some friendly competition, because everyone I find generally wants to do what's best for the organization, and the providers truly care. But when we think about like the modern structure, what does that modern revenue cycle structure kind of involve, for you, on thought processes, in about a 90-second clip, right? Just fast, rapid pace. What comes to mind right now in like that restructure thinking that we could say people should do?
Modernization is an interesting topic because we hear a lot about, oh, AI, like we have this new system that AI is going to solve the world problems. And modernization isn't about like buying a shiny new system, and it's not about AI. It's really about redesigning how our people, our processes, and our technology work together. Um, I I think that with the persistent margin pressures and the staffing shortages and the demand for remote work, and then the rapidly changing technologies that come with our EHRs, we have to stand up, cross-functional teams that can own revenue performance across the clinical, operational, and financial domains, and then have the authority to work with those teams and redesign and develop better workflows, and try to identify some of those friction points um, where we can you know deploy automation, or we can remove or change work. So that's one of the things that I've definitely seen, is just a lot of workflow redesign to improve our efficiencies and reduce the waste. And I guess what I found, it's been really motivating for a lot of teams, because they're not doing that mindless work anymore. They're doing work where they're actually thinking and using their critical thinking skills, and not just working in their siloed department, but interacting with departments across the organization. And so I've seen that what we call modernization is really an evolution of how we have to practice, moving forward into the future with all the changes coming at us.
Yeah. When we talk about modernization, though, too, I think that's one thing that, if folks like this conversation, and I hope they do, follow us as far as for more. This is a first of a multi podcast related series to where we're talking about the C suite edge inside revenue cycle and the changes. But when we talk about structure, that's one thing that I think, as we talk about the work or those automation pieces, if 80% of that workflow really lives within one area, or sometimes 70, as long as it's more than the 50-50%, that's sometimes where the data and the conversation of, the organizational structure or what may need to report to those areas happens. And what may happen today also from 2 years from now may also change, right? So that's something that I think when we talk about modernization, it's modernization for that revenue cycle roadmap for the next 6 months, year, and then really year over year asking, does this make sense? Because when we talk about, as far as managed care contracting, which we can get into more in later series, that's also something that guards against, protecting our revenue when it comes into rev cycle. So, in final comments and things for this morning's conversation, Casey, where can people find you or reach out if they, as far as have more conversations about the nursing background that you brought to rev cycle for your changes?
Well, definitely, you can find me on LinkedIn. Join one of our RCM innovators groups meetings. It's fantastic. We treat revenue cycle as the engine that funds our mission. And that's the message that we need to get out, and we need to outline the importance of the work that our leaders do in revenue cycle. So we would love to have people join us on RCM innovators group and collaborate, because we're all in this together.
And I think that's great for closing. So remember, RCM is all about innovation, collaboration, breaking down barriers in order to better serve our organizations and communities. So follow for more C-Suite Edge within Revenue Cycle. Thanks so much and have a great morning.